The following lecture will be on imagery in poetry, and I will discuss three poems: Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan, Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken, and Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ozymandias. Feel free to pause the video. It's going to be kind of a long video because I am discussing three different poems, but feel free to pause the video between poems. The reason why I'm putting them all in one video is because all three poems discuss the use of imagery. And so let's begin with Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan. This is a poem that came to Coleridge while he was high, basically. He was an opium smoker, after one particular episode of smoking opium, he came up with the idea for this poem. So if this poem sounds like something that was written by someone who is high, it is. But nevertheless, his poetic control suggests that he, was not totally out of control. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. And so a couple of things to note about imagery. Imagery works through words that have contain further references to space, to color, to sound, to movement. These are words that are evocative, right? They evoke rather than to contain further references. They evoke space, color, sound, movement, and this word evocation is super duper important, right? Because poetry depends upon words and how words carry certain connotations and denotations. Words that evoke space, color, sound, and movement are words that can be used to create imagery. And here, Coleridge creates imagery through this idea of a pleasure dome. So first of all, the word dome is loaded, right? It evokes in our mind the idea of something semicircular and something that contains something else. If you have a dome on top of something, whatever's inside that dome is being contained. And so his choice, Coleridge's choice of certain words, evoke for us certain kinds of spaces. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. And so we have this word decree also, which suggests to us that Kubla Khan was some kind of king. And within this dome, there's an entire world created, right? As you read the poem, you probably got a sense of that, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man. And although Kubla Khan obviously was a man and he declared this pleasure dome, the size of this dome is immense, right? And we get that through this word measureless, right? Through this word measureless, we have a word that evokes a tremendous sense of scale and of space as well. Although this is a man-made thing, it's huge. It's huge in scale. There was a river within this pleasure dome, and it was a river that ran through caverns. And again, the idea of caverns also as being something that is large, something that's huge and hollow, right? When we think of a cavern, we think of this idea of something that might be found within a dome, a cavern, the sense of echoing, hollowness, large hollowness. The words dome and cavern work together, and the idea of a river that is measureless to man gives a sense of the huge scale. Now, notice what's going on between lines. The other thing that I asked you to pay attention to in the previous poems that we discussed is this idea of end-stopped and enjambed lines. And one of the things we talked about in poetry was this idea of enjambment. Enjambment is a French word, or enjambment, if you prefer the French pronunciation, is where one line is supposed to be connected to the line that follows. And this is a perfect example of this, right? Where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man. Notice that we're supposed to read these things together. This word ran is enjambed, right? It's enjambed. What does that mean? it means that we're supposed to connect that line to the line that follows. So we're supposed to read where Alpha, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man. We don't stop with the word ran. We connect ran and through together, right? Because these lines are enjambed. And one of the reasons for using enjambment is to give a sense of continuity. And in this case, Coleridge wants the river to continue, right? Not just to start in one line, but to continue through these caverns. And not only through the caverns, but notice how this line, the man line, is enjambed with the next line, the down to a sunless sea line. Here's enjambment in line number 3, enjambment in line number 4, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. And finally, we get the period at the end of the word sea. And so what does this enjambment do? It creates a sense of continuity, and Coleridge obviously wants that continuity, because what's he trying to evoke? He's trying to evoke scale. How is this imagery of scale created? It's created through certain choice words, and it's also created through the enjambment, which allows lines 3, 4, and 5 to bleed into one another, and so give a sense of this river that really is flowing through the caverns and down to the sea. Notice also his choice of prepositions. The word through is a preposition, the word down is a preposition. And so we really get a sense of space, the evocation of space that I was talking about before. So twice, here's the new idea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, so 10 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers were girdled round. And notice this idea of this entire world that's being evoked inside this pleasure dome. So after the eye of our mind follows this river going down to a sunless sea, along the sea, right, girdled around the sea, and again, these words girdle round give us a sense of bordering, right? Just as the word dome gave us a sense of containment, so too do the words girdled round give us a spatial sense of being bordered. And so there's 10 miles of fertile ground that were girdled round with walls and towers. And so in your mind, there's an image evoked of really, really green grass, 10 miles, big acreage of green grass that is bordered with walls and towers. There's an entire world that's being created through the choice of images that Coleridge is using. And the semicolon here makes this an end stop line. Remember, lines are either enjambed or they are end stopped. And sometimes end stop can be just created through punctuation, right? Just a simple period or a semicolon can stop a line. And there were gardens bright with sinuous reels, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. Again, words that evoke images, words that evoke imagery, right? Bright with sinuous reels. Sinuous means something that is very, very angular, right? Curvature. So these words are all evoking a sense of shape. They're evoking a sense of color. They're evoking a sense of lightness and darkness, right? These are all evocative words. And incense-bearing gives us a sense even of smell, right? We can even smell this Xanadu. And here were forests ancient as the trees, enfolding sunny spots of green. And notice what Coleridge is doing. Words like dome and girdle round and now enfolding all give a sense of containment, of bordering, of wrapping around. And so we really do get a sense of this dome being created. So he may have been high, but he was very much in control of his words and images, wasn't he? But oh, that deep romantic chasm. And again, what is a chasm? It's a deep ravine. It's a huge gap between two things. And in this, again, the sense of space that's being evoked. What happened between these two large places that were divided by this huge chasm, which slanted down? Here's an enjambed line as well, right? Slanted down the green hill athwart of cedar and cover, And again, the word slanted gives you a sense of our eye is sort of moving down. It's declining in direction. Down a green hill and athwart a cedar and cavern. A cedar cover, excuse me. And again, the word slanted down and athwart, both prepositions which give us a sense of direction. Our mind's eye moves in this fictional place in a sense of going down, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as ever beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And notice the collection of words that Coleridge is giving us. Here we're getting really a sense of mood and tone, aren't we? Right? There's mood and tone established through words like savage, through words like haunted and wailing and demon lover, right? It's a place that's really, really fantastic to the eye, but at the same time there's a sense of darkness. And from this cavern, and again, notice the way that he uses his prepositions. You could really do a really interesting analysis of just Coleridge's use of prepositions in this poem to create this idea of imagery. From this cavern, so all this time we've been going down, 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 right? The rivers are flowing down. There's a slanting down. We have chasms, which suggest a downward movement. And from this cavern, for the first time, we have a different kind of directionality. From this chasm, with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast, thick pants was breathing. A mighty fountain momentarily was forced, amid whose half-intermittent burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail or chafy grain beneath the thresher's flail. Notice all these lines that I just highlighted in blue for you. Notice how many images there are now. Up until this point, all the images were downward images, moving down, the slanting down, the river flowing down to the sunless sea. Now, in these lines that I highlighted for you in blue, there's this idea of upward movement. There's something that's seething, right? There's turmoil seething from within this cavern. There's a movement upward. Here is thick, panting breaths as if the earth itself were alive, right? Remember we talked about similes and metaphors. As if, here's a liker asked to compare the earth to a breathing thing, right? Something that breathes and pants, breathes very very shallow, quick breaths. The earth as a living thing. And a mighty fountain was momentarily forced amid whose swift half-intermitted burst, this forcing, this burst, this vaulting, this rebounding, all of these words give a sense now of things being flung upward, right? So all of these words evoke an imagery of movement upward. It's almost as if things are coming out of this chasm. And again, the end-stop line with the punctuation of the colon. And mid these dancing rocks, at once and over, it flung up. And here he's very, very clear about what he wants us to see, right? The previous lines were just a setup for the flung up. And it's not just rocks that's this time that are being flung up. This panting, this heavy panting is actually flinging up the entire river. Can you even imagine in your mind what it must be like to have an entire river flung upward? I mean, it is such a striking, evocative image. We can imagine flinging up clothes, flinging up a ball. We can imagine flinging up a pen, small things we can fling up. Here he's imagining this kind of shaking, flinging up an entire river upwards. And mid these dancing rocks at once and ever it flung up momently the sacred river, 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion through wood and dale. And again, notice words like meandering, through wood and dale. Here's another example of preposition. The sacred river ran and then reached the cavern's measureless demand. This is an example, by the way, when a poet repeats his lines. This is an example. It's a poetic device called anaphora, right, where there's a repetition of words. We've seen these words before, right? Cavern, measureless demand. And we'll see an example of this in the Robert Frost poem as well. And so this movement upward of this river, which is now sinking in tumult to a lifeless ocean. Remember, ocean was mentioned before. Before it was a sunless ocean. So there's a repetition with a kind of difference over here, right, everybody? Before it was the sunless ocean where the river ran, and here it is the lifeless ocean. So this continues into the last bit of the poem. And amidst this tumult, there's a huge tumult. Kubla Khan heard, and so all of this imagery up until these words is about nature, and from nature we move to Kubla Khan. And amidst this tumult, Kubla Khan heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. And so all of this nature has something to do with human beings. All of this tumult has some implications of war that's going to come. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves. And so within this pleasure dome, all of a sudden, there is an implication. There is a foreshadowing of something bad to come. It's not all beautiful, right? Something in the tumult of the pleasure dome tells man that something bad is about to happen to his world. Not the fictional world, but the actual world where human beings live. Here, the shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, and it's almost as if that ocean is acting as a mirror upon which this entire dome, this dome which was so huge, which was measureless to man, all of a sudden can be captured, right? There's a shadow of this dome that can be captured on something that's finite, the waves. The sea becomes a mirror for capturing the dome itself, right? Something huge is all of a sudden now condensed to something small. Where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain in the caves? It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. And again, we have a change in tone, right? On the sea, it seems like a sunny pleasure dome. And then the last bit of image that we get over here, and again, if all of this doesn't make exact sense to you, remember, it is something that came to him in a kind of opium-induced vision. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid. There's sort of jump cuts, aren't there, of images. A damsel with a dulcimer. But again, even with these jump cuts, there's a control over the language. And that's the reason why I'm teaching this as an example of imagery in poetry. There's an extreme amount of control in the choice of words that he uses to evoke these images. This is a world that can come alive for us in our mind's eye because of the choice of words that Coleridge uses. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abara. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight 'twould win me. And here we finally get the eye perspective, right? It's not just about Kubla Khan anymore, but it's now about him trying to recreate for himself in his waking life that which he saw within his dream, within his vision. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight would win me that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware. And again, all of this seems so real in his sort of opium-induced vision, but it prompts him to want to wish he could do something like this in his real life. And if he could create something like this in his real life, all around him would cry, beware, beware. His flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice. And again, the circle round him thrice. We see the repeated image in Coleridge's poem of Containment. And close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. And so these last lines create a transition from the kind of manufactured paradise of Kubla Khan decreeing a stately pleasure dome to an actual paradise that the dreamer now wishes he could create. And if he were capable of creating in real life what the opium and his fantasies and his imagination have allowed him to create in this poem, people would say that this person has drunk from the milk of paradise. He was touched by the hand of God to have come up with something so divine, so inspired. So I'm going to pause here. You can pause here. And the next poem that I'm going to discuss for imagery will be Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ozymandias. So let us talk about Percy Shelley's Ozymandias, a much shorter poem than Kubla Khan, but again, very, very evocative of imagery in the same way that Coleridge's poem is. This is a very famous poem, by the way. If you leave this class remembering something about Ozymandias, you really will have gotten a lot out of this 152 class. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert." And notice we talked about rhyme and the ways in which rhyme organizes, the ways in which rhyme scheme organizes interpretive units. And notice here the rhyme scheme that's organizing the interpretive units is both end stop rhyme. So there's the land and the sand in lines 1 and 3, just as there's the stone and the throne in lines 2 and 4. But there's also rhyming between the land at the end of line 1 and the stand at the beginning of line 3. And so notice that the way in which Shelley is using rhyme is to organize an interpretive unit that begins with this rhyme of land over here and continues all the way until this stand over here. So there's a mini break there of one interpretive unit in between land and stand, and then another interpretive unit that extends the land all the way to the end of the line to the sand. And so keep these two things in mind. If rhyme can organize interpretive units, sometimes it can subdivide those units as well. So lines 1 to 3 are one unit because of land and sand, but within that one unit, there's a mini unit between land and stand over here. So what happens? The I, there's a first-person perspective in this poem, meets a traveler, and the traveler comes back from this land. And again, this idea of perspective is going to be very, very important in this poem. So whose perspective do we first get? First we get the I, but then immediately we switch over to the traveler who starts to narrate everything about Ozymandias, right? So within first-person perspective, we are getting third-person perspective, okay? And this is an interesting experiment, isn't it, right? Because we have both first and third-person perspective, right? But for a large part of the poem, after the word land, the third-person perspective, the one that's couched within the first-person perspective, gets started. So keep that in mind. That's another way of organizing interpretive units. Interpretive units along the lines of perspective through using rhyme. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, what did the traveler say? Here's the quote mark to tell you that we have a third-person voice. Or we have the traveler's own perspective. Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert, and here we have the imagery created, right, everybody? There's a desert, and the idea of vastness, again, the idea of imagery of scale, of immense scale, is created through the word vast, and it's a vast leg of stone. So there's a statue there, right, everybody? There's a leg of stone. We're going to get that later on, but there's a leg of stone. The word leg suggests that it resembles human beings, but it's not a human leg, it's a leg of stone. And a leg of stone suggests a statue. And we know that it's a statue because it is a leg that is not connected to a torso, right, everybody? It is a trunkless leg of stone. So if you should know, or if you did not know, you might have looked up the definition of the word trunk. What is a trunk? The trunk of the body is the upper torso. Okay, that's what the word trunk is being referred, that's how the word trunk is being used over here, right? Two vast and trunkless legs of stone. So something has happened to this statue that has caused the legs of the statue to be severed, right? To be severed from the trunk of the statue. Something has caused these huge slabs of stone that make up the statue to be severed from the torso. And where do they stand? They stand in the desert. Why would you make a statue in a desert? Wouldn't it make sense to put a statue somewhere where people actually can come and see it? Well, if that's the question that's going through your mind, it's the right question. That's exactly the question you should be asking. Because after the ... we get a further description. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. Let's pause over here, right? Because after the comma, Shelley will start talking about the sculptor, right? But before we get to the sculptor, these three lines, right? These are lines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Lines 5 through 7 talk about the statue itself, right? So these lines, near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. Just these lines tell us about the statue. What kind of statue is it? We already know that the legs are severed from the trunk. We already know that the face of the statue is shattered. And this word shattered has a double meaning, right? On the one hand, just as the legs of the statue have been broken off from the trunk of the statue, so too has the face of the statue been broken off from the rest of the body. How do we know that? Because the shattered visage lies near the trunkless legs of stone. The shattered visage lies near the trunkless legs of stone. Normally, where would we find a face? We would find a face above the legs and above the torso. Here, it's lying near them. And so we get a sense of the statue itself being shattered, but also notice the placement of the word shattered. The word shattered is also next to visage, which suggests that the way this face looks also is shattered. If someone is very, very depressed, you might look at their face and say they had a shattered visage. They were very, very depressed. They were crestfallen. They were really, really sad. They were heartbroken. They were shattered. And so the word shattered is working in two senses. It's working to create an image of the statue itself, but it's also working to create an image of what that face looks like. It's a face that is not happy. And we know that it's not happy because it's got a frown in this line. It's got a wrinkled lip, which suggests that, things are not, it's not a plump, healthy lip, it's a wrinkled lip. And most of all, it's got a sneer, right? The frown, the sneer, and the shattered visage all create the image of a face in our mind. And what kind of a sneer is it? It's a sneer of cold command. This should take you back to the Kubla Khan, right? Just as Kubla Khan is a king who decrees a stately pleasure dome, here, whoever this person was that had the statue made of him gave cold command that this statue should be built. There's a king involved in both Ozymandias and in Kubla Khan. And clearly, the king that has been captured in this statue is someone who is described as cold. Described as cold by who? By this third person narrator, by this traveler. Now the next lines switch us from the statue itself to the sculptor. All of these things, the frown, the wrinkled lip, the sneer of cold command, what do they tell us? They tell that its sculptor, the sculptor of the statue, well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. These three lines are also one interpretive unit. And how do you know they're an interpretive unit? Because the red line is the beginning of the interpretive unit and the fed line is the end of that interpretive unit. These two rhymes indicate that this is an interpretive unit. Again, rhymes organizing interpretive units. What do we learn about the sculptor? The sculptor, well those passions read. Remember we talked about poetry and sometimes that it inverts subject, verb, object order, right? So if we were to rewrite this, let's say in the form of a prose sentence, we would say something like, the sculptor, we would say something along the lines of, the sculptor read those passions, right? It would be the same thing, right? But instead, what Shelley is doing is that he's giving us the rhyme scheme, right? He wants the line to end with red, and now he doesn't want it to end with passions. He wants that red at the end of the line. And so the sculptor has seen, he has read. What has he read? He's read all the things about the subject that are cold. All the things that are in the subject that the sculptor has made a statue out of, he has well those passions read which yet survive. And interestingly enough, this idea of survive tells us that whoever it was that the statue was made of, they're dead. They are dead, and yet the passions on the face of that dead person have survived. How have they survived? They have survived through art. Art is something that preserves. It is something that memorializes and allows something to exist even after its subject is dead and gone. The sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. And so, although stones are lifeless things, stamped on these lifeless things, what does a sculptor do? He takes things that are inert, like stone, and he stamps on those inert things, things of real feeling, things that have passion to them, right? The word passion is contrasted against things that are lifeless. What has the sculptor transferred onto these lifeless things? He's transferred a frown, he's transferred a wrinkled lip, he's transferred a sneer, he's even transferred an entire visage that gives a sense of a shattered person, or at least someone who is really cold in the ways that he gives his commands. All these things have been stamped on the statue through the sculptor. The hand that mocked them. And interestingly enough, although the sculptor was probably a subject to this king, the sculptor was probably employed by the king, nevertheless, the hand of this lowly sculptor mocks this high king, this praiseworthy, this kind of exalted king. This hand, the hand of this artist, nevertheless mocks this high and mighty king. And how does that hand mock the king? He mocks him through the kind of image that he makes in that statue. And the heart that fed. And again, whose heart is being referred to here? It's the heart of the sculptor. We know this because we begin with the sculptor in this line, and we end with the sculptor's heart in this line. All the things that this cold king did to the sculptor has fed that heart, and that fed heart has resulted in a hand that has mocked the king that has asked for the statue to be made of him. Here's your next unit, and on the pedestal these words appear, and here it's very clear that a statue is being referred to, right? It's clearly a broken statue, but it does have a pedestal, and on that pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. And obviously, we have another perspective here, don't we, right? We already had the eye perspective, we had the traveler's perspective, and now we have Ozymandias' perspective. And it almost seems as if Ozymandias is speaking in these lines, right? These words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, and so now we know who the statue is of. It is of this great king who wants the people who are going to look on the statue to consider how mighty he is and to despair of his power. But of course, there's a contrast created, right? If the idea behind creating the sculpture was to instill awe in the onlooker and to instill despair in the onlooker, instead, what feelings have been evoked in all of these lines? Are we awestruck by these lines? Or instead, do we have an Ozymandias who has been mocked? Do we have an Ozymandias who has been shown to be really, really cold and not at all mighty? And do we have an Ozymandias who really is broken? He's trunkless. his visage is shattered, right? And he is, in fact, he has ended up in a desert. We may want to ask ourselves, how do you go from the statue being created in a place where Ozymandias is expecting a whole bunch of people to look at him in despair? What would happen to such a crowded place, or such a place that has such a human population that they can come and watch this sculpture? What would happen? How much time would need to pass before such a crowded place could end up being nothing more than a desert? And so again, we have this idea of the passage of time. The fact that time diminishes all great things. Not only is the sculpture of Ozymandias, not only has that been diminished, but even the place where the sculpture was supposed to instill awe and despair in the onlooker, even that place has, over the passage of time, been reduced to nothing but an empty desert. Nothing beside remains round the decay, and we get a sense of this desolateness, right, through the word decay, through the word bare. Nothing beside remains. In other words, all that's left is the pedestal, the trunkless legs of stone, the shattered visage. That's the only thing that you find in the middle of this desert. And in your mind, you know exactly what a desert looks like. The imagery is evoked of the desert. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. And that's what this immense statue, which once might have inspired awe, has become. Time has taken this huge, awe-inspiring statue and made a colossal wreck out of it. And that word wreck is so loaded. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless, again, a sense of scale, boundless and bare, the alliteration of the B and B sound, right? Boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. We have despair and bare, two words again which indicate how time takes things which are supposed to create despair, and instead time transforms those things into images that are bare of meaning. How time takes things that are great and causes them to decay. And just as time causes mighty stone statues to decay, those sands of time will continue to stretch far away. And so the poem not only ends with this broken statue of Ozymandias sort of being the middle of the focus of this image of us watching our eyes, and our eyes are sort of being taken far away from the statue as the sands of the desert stretch far away. Mentally, there's an image of motion here, right? There's movement as our eyes are stretching far away from the broken statue. The only thing that we see is sand. The only thing that we see is time immemorial, right? If the whole idea behind Ozymandias creating the statue was to preserve himself forever and ever more, the only thing that stays preserved, the only thing that is everlasting, is the ways in which time takes everything and diminishes everything that comes before it. So I'm going to pause here, and the next recording will be of Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken. So if you want to put a pause over here, you can. Pick up with Frost next.